Hi, I'm María Elena Fernández. I am a researcher at the National Council of Scientific Research of Argentina, and also I am the chair of editors-in-chief of the journal Forest Ecology and Management. This talk about writing and publishing scientific articles is dedicated to beginners, graduate students, young scientists, or in fact, whoever is struggling to publish their papers. I hope its content is useful for you. Okay, let's begin for the beginning. Why do we have to write papers? Of course, beyond the obvious to survive as a scientific system. Well, the scientific articles, the papers, are the record of the scientific knowledge. That is the way that the knowledge is made available to other people to build new knowledge. As it has its own discourse. So we need to reformulate that discourse in order to get other audiences, such as decision makers, managers, educators, or the general public. In addition, if we want to have a societal impact with our science, we need not only to change the discourse, but also to apply other strategies, somewhat difficult strategies for us. So we need interdisciplinary work. This is a very nice paper about why facts don't change mind. But there is another issue. Okay, another important characteristics of papers is that before being published, they go through the peer review process, which means that the scientific knowledge passes a filter to control the internal logic, the replicability, the clarity of the message. And at this stage, it received the contribution of other colleagues, the peers, acting as scientific editors and reviewers. But the question is, why is so hard, at least for many people, to write papers? When we study science, we don't learn formally, at least, how to communicate science, neither internally, so to write papers, nor to other audiences to make a scientific divulgation. In general, we learn by imitation and by trial and error. It is assumed that we will learn writing by reading papers, as we learn to speak by hearing others when we were childs. But is it so automatic? No, it isn't. Well, as any other skill, there are three things for them. There is a natural ability. Some people have this ability and others don't, and we cannot change that. Some of us are good writing or at sports or with other abilities. But then there are 2 points that we can change: learning and practice. Nowadays, there are many resources for formal and non-formal education available in the internet, such as blogs, seminars, courses, talks, etc. So look for them and ask for help. In addition to the education, at a personal level, it is hard, I think, to handle criticism we receive when our papers are sent for review. And in particular, it's difficult to cope with rejection. As adults, we struggle with the idea of living in a system of permanent or continuous evaluation. And we have to assume this. Science is a system of continuous evaluation. So we have to learn to cope with this. The criticism is, or at least should be, never personal. We are not judged as researchers or people. In addition, the criticism should be used to improve the final product, the final paper. Should be taken as a help, as a contribution for an anonymous expert in other part of the world to make better my own paper. And it's important to remember always that science is a process of collective construction of knowledge founded on ethical principles. Before going through the rest of the talk, I would like to give a general advice. Any paper will be much easier to be written and to be published elsewhere if the research to be communicated was well planned before the writing process. So, invest time on reading, thinking, and planning before going to the field to collect your data. Okay, where do we publish papers? Well, we publish papers in scientific journals. The scientific journals have in general one or more editors-in-chief, plus associate editors or board members. They are scientists that handle the articles and define the journal scope. What is the journal about? All papers are reviewed by specialist colleagues, the peer review process I mentioned before, but the editor-in-chief makes the decision on each paper based on their own criteria, the associate editors, if any, and the reviewers' opinions, so the external opinions. The scientific journals can depend and be run by scientific associations and societies, universities, scientific institutes, academic institutes, or by private companies dedicated to scientific publishing, such as Elsevier, Springer, Wiley, etc. In all cases, or in most cases at least, the scientific editors and reviewers are our colleagues, are scientists. The scientific journals may be oriented to local, regional, or international scientific audiences. And how do we to get access to the knowledge published in paper? Well, by two main ways. By the subscription system, in which the reader or the institution paid for the access to the information, or by the open access, which have two different systems in general: the gold open access, in which the author pays for publishing once the paper is accepted, or in the diamond open access system, in which non-profit institutions paid for all the cost of publishing. I want to make here just a side comment related to the money related with the publishing system. There is a lot of money involved in publishing science, which, in addition to complex global socioeconomic trends and internal forces within the scientific system, have unfortunately led to growing fraud and some shade businesses nowadays that threaten the science trustability. There is hot debate now in relation to open access, paper mills, predatory journals, etc. And this debate is very necessary to reinforce and to protect science integrity and equity. This talk is not about this, but I wanted to mention it for you to be aware of that. Okay, let's go to the paper structure. I'm going to talk about the original papers or the regular papers, okay? I'm not going to talk about other kinds of papers such as opinion papers or review papers. First of all, the paper should tell a story, okay? Take this in mind when you are writing a paper. So as any story, it has a beginning, which is the introduction. So a nice question, a nice problem to be solved is the story hook. It has a middle formed by the methods applied and the results you obtain, and an ending, which are the conclusions. There are, as any other ability, more or less attractive and clear ways of telling a story, but order and logical internal coherence are essential in a scientific paper. There is no freestyle here. This is not fiction. So there is a defined structure for a scientific paper. And here we have that structure. Normally, the core of the paper has these four main parts: the introduction, the material and methods section, the results, and the discussion. What do you put in the introduction? Well, in this first part, we have to put the available knowledge. What do we know about your main topic? Then you have to put here which are the knowledge gaps in relation to that topic. This is very important because from the knowledge gaps, you deduce your research question. What do you want to know? And in this first part, you also put your hypothesis. The hypothesis is the tentative response to your research question based on what is already known about the topic. All this information should be in the introduction. Then in the next section, you put your experimental design, the measured variables, and the statistical analysis. Then, in the next section, you put the results, which are the analyzed data. And then in the final section, you state the provisional answer to your research question, and you discuss it in the framework of the available knowledge. Okay? Well, this former structure applies to all kinds of papers. For a local or a national journal, and also for an international journal. But the rest of the talk, I would like to focus on publishing on international scientific journals, which is probably the most challenging part of our job. Which are the readers of an international scientific journals? Well, the readers are an international audience, people all around the world, of course, scientists all around the world. And if you have this in mind, this can guide you to tell the story for that public, for that audience. In addition, the authors of international journals are scientists distributed all around the world, so the competition is rather high. International journals have, in general, the highest impact factor and other related indicators, which means that the articles are more cited on average. And what does this mean? That more scientists use knowledge published there to build their own piece of knowledge. It's important to know that this is a measure of internal impact within a scientific discipline. This is not a measure related with economic or the social impact of your work. In addition, publishing there in scientific international journals give us generally more professional prestige, which means that usually have more weight in our academic evaluations to get a promotion, to access to a fellowship, to get the tenure. They require that the papers, because the audience is international, they require that the papers be written in a unique language, able to be understood by people distributed all around the world. That language is nowadays English. And yes, that's maybe a problem, or at least it is a barrier. So needs an extra work for most of us that that we don't have English as our native language. And it is studied that this barrier is higher as further is the native language in linguistic terms from English. So I'm not going to talk about this. That needs another talk, but it is very important to develop national and international policies and actions to reduce those barriers as other barriers, such as related with gender, for instance. Okay, let's go through some tips to publish in an international journal. First, the editor's criteria to select which papers are rejected without review, which is known as the desk rejection, or go to review, are multiple and somewhat subjective, but in general, papers are chosen in an international journal if they are well in line with the journal scope. So please read it carefully. The journal scope is written in the journal web page always. Second, papers that present more novelty and originality. So papers that move the frontier of knowledge a little farther. These kind of papers are preferred over papers that make confirmatory science. That is, those papers or those studies that measure something that is very well known in some species or regions and is measured again in another species or another region. And third, they prefer papers that may be of higher interest for their particular but international community of readers that again are distributed all around the world. So in this regard, it's important that the study problem should be presented in terms of its contribution to the general topic, the theoretical or the general framework, and not from the point of view of the place or particular subject of study. Our study system should be a model system to answer a more general question in order to be of interest to an international audience. Of course, if you have a paper oriented to a regional audience, you have to present it from the point of view of your region, of your country, or of your system. Which studies are more attractive to a wide international audience? Well, first, studies that explore causes, why something happens, and not just patterns. This required manipulation and experimentation, which means money. And in this regard, be careful with causal inferences from observational data. In addition, studies with large population of inference, not limited case studies. And again, wider studies require more money invested in human and material resources. It's very important to cooperate with other researchers within your country or outside it. Additionally, you can make meta-analysis from published data. There's a lot of data available now, but in this case, it's very important to explore good questions and to have solid statistical skills. And in addition, studies are attractive if they have high novelty in research questions or methodological approach. If the scientific question is highly novel, normally there is no need for a large population of inference, but it implies a high risk for publication because unfortunately it is rather hard for new ideas to penetrate or to challenge established theories. In general, science is rather conservative. Now I'm going to talk briefly about the different parts of the paper, or the main parts of the paper. First, the title and the abstract. Well, these are the first thing read by editors when they receive your paper. And a large part of the initial decision, the desk decision, is based on them. And this is the unique part of a paper that most readers are going to read when the paper is published. So the message here is that they are a very important part of your paper. So write them at the end when you have the whole picture and the main findings very clear in your head. At this stage, you'll probably be tired and bored and often hating your article. So rest and dedicate time and fresh energy to write them because they are very important. The title should be attractive if possible, but at the same time avoiding overstating or even lying about the content. The abstract requires a good distillation and synthesis of the essentials of the study. Normally, between 200 and 500 words, you have to count the whole story. So normally there is a first sentence with the general problem of the framework, then a sentence with your research question or your objectives, then a couple of sentences with your study system and the main methodology, then a couple of sentences with your main results, and please put here some quantitative data, and finally a final sentence with the main conclusion. Then the introduction, when you talk about why and what for. Here we have to engage readers in our story. In fact, we have to engage readers in with the title and abstract. But if you you could do that, and the readers are now reading your introduction, here you have to explain them why and what for is important to know what we studied. Here you have to put the importance and the novelty of the studied issue. So the paragraphs should be ordered from the general issues to the more particular ones. The investigated problem should be stated in terms of the general topics, as I mentioned before, the theoretical framework, not from the point of view of the study region or subject. Be brief in this part. Normally 4 or 5 paragraphs are usually enough, but at the same time you have to put here all the necessary information to demonstrate that there are gaps in knowledge that you want to fill and to derive the hypothesis. Read and cite original sources, original references, and read and cite the most current bibliography about a topic to prove that something is not known yet. State at the end of the introduction, state clearly the objectives and research questions. If you have those parts very clear, they guide the rest of the paper. And at the end of the introduction, normally you set your hypotheses, and they should be set well in logical terms. This is not always easy, so please get advice and learn about hypotheses, predictions, etc. This is a very important part of making science in general. The next part is the materials and methods, when you talk about how. Here you have to describe, to provide information, detail and all other information to understand, but also to replicate what was done. Here you don't have to be brief. You have to be very clear and detailed. You're going to explain your model and place of study, your experimental design, the design of observations, the variables measured, the number of replicates for each measure, and sometimes you put here a map of the study region or the distribution of your plots, etc. All the information needed to replicate your study. The measured variables should respond to the research questions. You don't have to measure something because you know how to measure it or because you have the instrument. And the variables has to be useful to respond or to test your hypothesis. And finally, you put in this section the statistical analysis you did, which again should allow testing the hypothesis and respond the scientific questions. The next section is the results, what was observed. Here you should show only the main results during the research. This is rather difficult because usually we do a lot of things, but those things not necessarily are going to appear in the paper. So first you have to do a work of synthesis to define what is more or less important to be shown. Make an effort to streamline the message to make a smooth pathway for the reader along the story. Remember, you are telling a story. Think about which is the best way to communicate the selected results. A figure, what kind of figure? A table. And there are other important tips. For instance, use the proper size of the font. Use always the same codes and colors and terms for the same things along the whole manuscript. Do not repeat the same information in two different formats. And as a general advice, take ideas of how to communicate results from other papers that have been useful and clear for you. In addition, complementary or supporting results can be shown as supplementary material, not to distract the reader from the main message of the paper. This is a very useful tool. This is a very useful option we have to add more information, but at the same time having a very focused paper. And finally, do not discuss the results. Show them as aseptic as possible and clear as possible in this section, because another colleague can interpret a different thing from the same result. And it's important to get the information very clear and without interpretation in this section. Then the discussion. Here you talk about was the hypothesis verified, why yes or why not. In my personal opinion, this is the most difficult part of the paper and requires a lot of reading to make a solid discussion. How to start? Start with a brief synthesis of the main results at the light of the main question. Here, the first paragraph, here you have to remind the reader which was your research question and which was your main answer to that question. Then in the next paragraphs, you're going to discuss those results. Make a different paragraph for each idea. Start each paragraph with a topical sentence and then discuss it. That is, start each paragraph saying what are going to talk about in this paragraph. Discuss always the measured variables in light of how they contribute to answer your questions or your objectives. If you have several particular objectives or questions, it is useful to separate them into subsections with subheadings. In this section, you have to expose clearly and honestly the limitations of your study. All studies have limitations. And at the end of the discussion, sometimes as a different section, but you can put it inside the discussion at the end, the conclusions should indicate the main contribution of the study, their implications for other aspects or fields, for instance, for management, for policies, etc. And here you can put the main open avenues for future work. This is very useful for you and for other scientists to continue your work. Okay, but even if you make everything well and you have a good paper, there is no guarantee of acceptance in the journal you chose. And it's important to remember that rejection is the norm, not the exception. After the initial disappointment, if you receive a rejection, give it space and time to get out of your first emotions. For instance, at the other day, revise the paper or start to revise the paper according to the criticism you received. Use that as a contribution to improve your paper and then send it to another journal. And if the study has severe flaws and you realize that thanks to the reviewers, do not send it to publish elsewhere. Use this as a learning experience. Next time you'll do it better. Final thoughts. Well, you have to read a lot of papers to take ideas of how to communicate science, but fundamentally to detect gaps in knowledge, formulate good, which means interesting, original, novel questions, and also to discuss deeply your results. Science is not based on divine inspiration, but on the work of other people. To formulate our own ideas, we always stand on the shoulders of other scientists. So to finish, I would like to read you a quote from an Argentinian scientist who received the Nobel Prize in the middle of the 20th century, who said, "For a firm will, nothing is impossible. There is nothing easy or difficult. Easy is what we already know how to do. Difficult is what we have not yet learned to do well." So learn and practice how to write, and I promise it's going to be easier with time. Thank you very much for your attention.